With every single God Wars dungeon front released, it's time to compare all 4 of these on a variety of different aspects, including the community poll scores. Whenever you're ready, grab your cup of tea, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before the release of the first Elder God Wars dungeon front, I wasn't really sure what to expect from these updates, but not long after the release of the first front, I knew we were going to be in for a treat. Before I rate the fronts based on my opinion, I'd like to show you the average score my community, aka you guys, gave each and every boss out of 10 in terms of fun. Now there are many variables to these polls, so they aren't a 100% accurate representation of the community's opinion, but it is a decent sample size of what people on YouTube think of these bosses. So here we go. Out of all 4 bosses, you can clearly see just by looking at the bars and percentages that out of the 11 or 13,000-ish people that voted, depending on which poll you're looking at, most of the people seem to like Kerapac and the Arch-glacor. If we take a look at Croesus and Tzekhaar, we can see that a larger portion of players dislike these bosses, in terms of fun anyways, and you can also see that there's more discussion or explaining going on about these ratings on these polls because both of these almost have double the comments of the other 2 bosses. Now if we take the average number of each range and we times that by the percentage as the weighting, we get these average scores for the bosses. As you can see, the Arch-glacor has the highest average score and Croesus, the group skilling boss, has the lowest average score. And I think neither of those are a surprise to most players. I will be rating each front based on how fun the boss is, how unique the boss is mechanically or something else, how replayable the boss is, the entire visual appearance and graphics of the front, other front content, the music, and I'll be mentioning how high or low the reward impact is. Kicking off with the first Elder God Wars dungeon front, aka the Nodon front, we have a pretty fun boss, although I personally didn't do that much Kerapac kill count. I think I stopped around 90-95ish kill count and I haven't gone back since, but I see myself going back to this boss because of how unique the gameplay is. The time warp mechanic allows you to pull off some pretty funky PvM rotations or just use it as a snapshot of your adrenaline and health to just have some fun with the boss, really, and it's a really enjoyable mechanic. Now while the boss is really interesting, I think the area and the entire front feels somewhat lacking visually, maybe because the area is so large, but it feels a bit empty and bland at times. That could be because of the color scheme though. It isn't ugly or anything, but the other fronts just look better. The music slaps really hard, and this is probably one of the better Runescape soundtracks in the game currently. The other front content is the best in its class because it has a proper Slayer task with drops, and the Slayer task is pretty good XP wise as well. The average score this front will receive is 7.2 out of 10 if we take all factors into account. The reward impact is of course high due to major magic buffs, including the Fractured Staff of Arminal, Greater Concentrated Blast, Kerapac's wrist wraps, which are basically a switch, and some other things including those cannons and new Godbook, which aren't style specific, but you know what I mean. Next up, the Glacor front, featuring perhaps the most enjoyable boss in RuneScape, being the Arch-glacor. This boss feels unique, looks fantastic, and is customizable to your liking depending on how good you are at PvM. For learners, you can turn off mechanics on normal modes, and for good players, you can push all the way up to 4000% in Rage in hard mode. Covering that range of players with a PvM boss in RuneScape is a credible achievement. The fact that this wasn't a spreadsheet boss made the boss so much more enjoyable, and it's one of the only bosses I've killed hundreds of times within release week. That's how much I enjoyed this boss. This consequently also makes the boss so much more replayable because every fight is different, at least in terms of rotation order. Now while I do like the music, it misses that kick, if that makes sense. It does fit the theme well, but it just doesn't have that kick to it like Kerapac's theme or one of the other themes we'll be talking about soon. Now while the boss is really good, the other front content was really lacking. Glacors already existed, although they did get a graphical overhaul, and the small Glacors added to the front are only really good for Slayer and common experience and aren't really good for anything else. Maybe Clue Scrolls, but apparently Hellhounds were better. The front will receive a 7.5 out of 10 on average, which is only really brought down to the other front content being somewhat lacking, but the reward impact is also low because the tier 95 melee weapons were really underwhelming. The weapons felt like you needed to squeeze every ounce of damage boost you could out of your character to get anything out of the special attack. Now while the scripture is really good for slaying PvM, it isn't much more than a replacement for godbooks and scrimshaws. Next up, the skilling front, aka the Croesus front, which in my opinion was the least enjoyable boss. Now there's a very good reason for that, and that is because once you figured out what was going on, the boss felt really samey, it felt like a spreadsheet boss basically, and having to find a group for a boss isn't always fun. Public kills or kills with randoms were awful on release day. It did get better over time. I didn't do very much kill count because I simply don't like this boss. That doesn't mean it's bad, because it's something for skillers, and if we take a step back, this boss is definitely very unique, and perhaps the most unique Elder Gold Rush Dungeon front boss, because it isn't a PVM boss. Visually, the entire front looks really eerie, and it fits the theme well, and it looks pretty. I especially like the way the water looks. But I don't necessarily like Croesus' model. It kind of reminds me of those mandrakes from Harry Potter, you know, those angry turnip things which screech. Now, while the music isn't entirely my thing, it does sound nice, and it reminds me of those classic Runescape songs especially, and the area song, which plays if you're just at the front, is creepy and fits the theme perfectly. The other front content is basically irrelevant apart from making some soups if you're an Iron Man, getting some lore books, and that's about it, because the XP is lower than the majority of methods outside of the area, which makes it not very much worth training there. This front will get an average of 6.1 and has a reward impact that is medium due to the crit bloom armor, which in combination with Animate Dead is extremely strong, and the Scripture of Bic being very good for getting clue scrolls. And here we arrive at the final Elder Gold Rush Dungeon front, being the Tzekhaar front. Now this is a really fun challenge, and I say challenge because it doesn't necessarily feel like a boss sometimes, because of all of the waves you need to do before you actually reach Zuck, which is the boss. Even though there's many differences between this and the fight kiln, I don't think stuff's different enough to call it fully unique, but that's almost impossible since stuff is reused but buffed, or has more abilities and there's more challenges, but it doesn't necessarily have to matter because it's a fun experience and it's definitely a challenge. It's also visually pleasing, though if you look closely at some of the textures or the way the lava looks, it's slightly lacking in my opinion compared to, for example, the Arch-glacor front. Now I say this boss is a challenge because you need to conserve your supplies, both prayer and food. You need to know what you're doing, you need to utilize safe spots, run around, AoE down minions, get them done quickly, you need to know how to DPS, and apart from being a skill check, the final boss is very much also a gear check, because without good gear, there's no way you're going to be getting past those DPS checks. And if you want a flawless run to unlock hard mode, which admittedly should be hard to unlock, you're going to need good gear anyways to get through all of the challenge and DPS checks throughout the entire fight. And it only makes sense that the best in slot capes are locked behind you having to do a full run without dying. The way they balance this out nicely is by adding checkpoints for players that might die, which will allow them to kill Zuck and still get loot, but just not the cape. I also really like that flawless runs aren't required for loot, and you only really need to do one flawless run in normal mode and one flawless run in hard mode to get the hybrid cape, and then you can go back to messing up things without having to worry about getting flawless runs. The boss has repeatability due to having drops, which are very expensive, and of course the challenge of getting that hybrid cape, but I do think that the majority of players will stop after getting their 3 capes upgraded, which requires 3 deathless runs. I would also say that the other front content is basically non-existent, but just to be nice I'll give it a 2, and the music is of course worth a 10. Come on, this track is amazing. This will give the front an average of 6.75, and the reward impact is of course high due to the capes being strong, the new ability being strong, and the T95 melee weapon seeming to be very strong as well. In terms of the order from worst to best, if I take my average score, the worst to best order is exactly the same as the community poll average in terms of fun. The worst being Croesus, then the Tzekhaar front, then the Nodon front, and finally the Arch-glacor front being the best overall. Be sure to let me know what your favorite Elder Gold Rush Dungeon front is and why in the comments down below. With that being said, if you enjoyed the video or found it interesting, leave a like down below and maybe even consider subscribing, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.